So as we dive back in, any questions or comments? Just thinking about words, right? I mean, obviously our Bibles are full of words, and so much of just understanding the meaning of the Bible is studying the words of the Bible. And, I think one of the questions, kind of Carla was bringing up too, is like, how do you know even which words are significant in a passage? And, sometimes when you're reading through Paul, you could tell like his whole argument is hinging on this one word, or it's kind of a big important word, or it's a word that's repeated throughout that section. And you were just talking about in James, right? How that testing and tempting and how those words are translated. It's so vital to understanding what, James is getting at. So, I think just once again, there's no magic formula, for how to do these things. But I think the best idea is just be observant. Just ask questions. Why did he use this word? He could have used maybe this other synonym. Why did he use this one? Look up a word. We're going to talk about now how do we do word studies. And as Pat was bringing out, there's two basic ways to do that, and so we're going to look at kind of both of those. And you could do both of these. There's different tools that could help. Even just once again, an old school concordance. You could do these things. Some dictionaries. And so anyway, we'll get into that in a little bit. But just be observant. Just be a good detective. We're just going to keep coming back to that. Just keep asking yourself, why do you use that word? What's he saying? Is he communicating anything significant? Is he repeating that word? Is this a key word that kind of ties into the biblical storyline? And as you just kind of, as a good detective, just asking those questions, being observant, that's going to help you to understand, oh, he said this or that, and why does he say that? What does he mean? Okay, so word studies. And there's two basic ways to do word studies. And the first is what we call use lexicons. Now, that's a fancy word. It just means a dictionary. But it's a dictionary that's not in your same. So like we have an English dictionary. It has an English word and an English definition, right? So a lexicon would have a Greek word and an English definition. Does that make sense? Or a Hebrew word and an English definition. Okay, so you could look up words in these different dictionaries. And, we want to start with, there's a difference between a gloss and a definition. We kind of mentioned that. So if you're looking at a dictionary, it's going to have this one word kind of like gloss, like this word in Greek, this word means send away, right? But then if it has a definition, that is so helpful, because then it kind of helps you to get your mind around, like, the definition, if it's done well, will kind of give you the whole scope of the word. Does that make sense? Rather than just like, because as we said before, I think I said this, in any two languages, there's never a perfect correspondence between an English word and a Greek word. Like there's never two words are exactly the same word, because they're two different languages. They use the words in different ways. Now, there could be some words are closer in meaning than others, but there's never like, I could translate from, if you know another language, Spanish, right? You can never translate from Spanish to English. There's never such thing as a perfect translation, right? Like why this word corresponds to this word. Any language, Chinese to Spanish, English to Russian. It doesn't matter what the two languages, there's never this perfect correspondence. So there's always like, well, how do we get across what they mean here in this language? And so that's why we talked about this with Bible translations even, right? That's why some translations try to be word for word. We're going to like, every time we see this word in Greek, we're going to use this word in English. But the problem with that is you don't come across with the meaning fully, right? Because different words can have different meanings. And sometimes it's helpful to take this word in Greek and put two words in English, because that maybe kind of captures it a little bit better, right? The clearest example of that I could think of is in Hebrew. If you know one word in Hebrew, it should be this word hesed, which is this word meaning loyal love or covenant love or faithful love. It's often translated loving kindness in your Bibles. But I like the translation probably loyal love. That's probably about as good as any. But it's really marriage love. It's in a lot of contexts, it means something very close to just faithfulness. But in other contexts, it could kind of get more of the love side of it. You see what I'm saying? So that's why a two-word translation is probably best usually, because it's such a rich word. Like if you just put it faithfulness, that works most of the time, but it's not like this dry, I'm faithful to my contract, business contract, right? It has this concept of, it really is marriage love, like faithful love in marriage is really kind of the heart of that word. So, and if I just translate it love, well, that's great. That kind of gets the emotive part of the word, but not the loyalty and the faithfulness aspect of the word. So, usually you translate it loyal love. But then even then, it's like different. That word, unfortunately, it will get translated a bunch of different ways, because they're trying to get the richness of that word across in different contexts. Okay, so once again, that faithfulness or love or loyalty or all these different words that kind of like are good one-word glosses, they're not a definition. The definition, I don't know, I'd have to look it up and read it to you. But it kind of like, okay, someone who, is in this relationship with another person and they're faithful, it would give this definition of what it meant. Okay, so we already talked about that. So, and some lexicons just give glosses, and it's because it's actually to if you're going to be a lexicographer, your job is to make dictionaries. That it takes decades for these guys to do that, and it takes a lot of work and it's hard to do well. So anyway, yeah. So we already said this, understand the range of meaning of the word. And I don't mean just in general, but, if you're studying James, right, you want to look up that word temptation, parosmos, and, look it up in Greek. And, okay, what's the range of, what all can this word mean? What's all the different definitions? Which one is used here? Is he using the same definition all throughout this passage, or is he kind of using two different definitions in this passage? And, so you just kind of want to start by understanding, okay, what's the basic meaning of this word? I always like to start with, like, I want to understand really well that first definition that's listed, because you could call that the basic meaning of the word. If sometimes it's the literal meaning, and then there's figurative meanings built on it, but they always put number one, kind of like the most common or the most basic meaning of the word. I want to really understand that, and then I want to understand, does that fit in my passage, or is it one of these other secondary meanings, or is it a technical term? Is the author using that word in a kind of a special way? And then, once again, is he using it the same way throughout my passage, or is there like a play on words? And authors can do that, right? They could use the same word and use like one meaning here and one meaning here. And we do that in English without realizing, right? Kind of as a joke, like that's those really bad dad puns, right? Like where you're playing off of like two different meanings of a word. And biblical authors can do that, right? And so if they're doing something like that, and it's not super common, but you want to notice if they are. And then, like I said, okay, it's not going to mean all of those things. So which one does it mean here? And that's what we're gonna look at some examples of this. We already kind of talked about this. Some of the meanings are derived from the basic meaning. So, but the figure, if you will, like we said with the word like remit a debt. If you understand that this has this idea of letting something go, I just think it will give you a fuller understanding of what forgiveness is, right? And so almost always, if there's like a figurative meaning based on the literal meaning, that literal meaning can often just kind of give you a little bit more clarity on what this word is communicating. Does that make sense? Because what inevitably in English, our words, they do the same thing, right? They have literal meanings and figurative meanings built off of them, but they're not the same connections. Are you with me? Right? So, I don't know. I'd have to think of an example. Anyway, we'll come up with some, but they're not the same connections. And so understanding in their mind, forgiveness has to do with this idea of letting something go. Okay, that's just helpful. Okay, and so that's true for most. Now, a lot of times, I want to say this too. We talked about, I don't know how many classes ago, the difference between minimalism and maximalism in studying. In other words, when you're studying the Bible, some preachers will do this, right? They're preaching through Romans. It's like a new sermon on every word, right? And it's like, you could do like, and I don't think that's really how language works, right? The meaning is found in this sentence, in this paragraph. You don't want to get too bogged down in the words, like there's a sermon in every word. No, he just used a word, right? So don't make too much out of it. So, this lesson, you could go too far with it, okay? With just like, but that doesn't mean words do have meaning, and they are important, and there is, so we'll get it. I'll give you some examples. We're going to end this whole lesson with all the ways you could do it wrong, and it kind of humorous examples, right? And so you don't want to like, if that's why I said like if I said I let the goat go, I don't want to be like I divorced the goat, I forgave the goat, that's obviously reading too much into it. You can be like, oh, the symbolism here is so rich and deep. No, he just let the goat go. Don't make a big deal. You see what I'm saying? So we want to have some kind of limits on our craziness, But what does the word mean? And anyway. And once again, one meaning is intended in a given context. I keep repeating that because that's one of the biggest errors we can make, where you're trying to like read all the meanings into one word, and you're like, wow, look how rich this is. This word could mean all these things, and you put them all back into one. And it's like, no. That's what I'm doing with the goat, okay? Don't do that. Now, also note, there's different definitions, so for nouns and verbs. So like in English, the word run, it could be, did everyone know the difference between a noun and a verb? So like a noun is person, place, thing, idea. Wait, did I miss one? That's a noun, right? A noun is a naming word, like chair. Okay, we all know what a chair is, and I just gave a name to that thing. And then a verb is an action word. So like I went on a run. In that case, run is a noun. But if I said I ran, that's a verb. Or I could say I guess you wouldn't. I run for fun. I will run, or I run for fun. That's a verb. So run, it could be a verb. I will run tomorrow. I run all the time. That's a verb. But I went on a run. That's a noun. And both of those will have their own definitions. Are you with me? A definition for the noun, definition for the verb. Same thing in Greek and Hebrew. Okay, so there's a lot of times there's verbs and nouns that are the same root word, but they're different words. Okay, and you got to know which one it is. And then even for verbs, they're often the definitions will kind of be broken down for the kind of verb. So I list kind of a fancy definition here. This is a little bit into grammar. Transitive and intransitive. So here's bonus question. You want to know the difference between transitive and intransitive? It's kind of, you have to get pretty into grammar. No. Yeah, it's object. Yeah. So like, I ran, that's intransitive. Okay, it doesn't have a direct object. I ran a business, that's transitive. So that same verb can be transitive or intransitive, and in the dictionary, it'll list definitions for when it's transitive and definitions for when it's intransitive. We'll look at this, okay? And those you could even just hear that, right? I ran for fun yesterday at the park. Okay? I ran a business for 20 years doing this. Selling shoes. You with me? So you could even tell those are different. It's the same verb, run, but they're different definitions. When it takes that object, it kind of has some different flavors to it, right? You with me? So we'll see this in just a minute. We're going to look at all these different examples. And so I know this is kind of technical, but just be aware, right? This is how words are very complex in the way that they get used, and they can be used in all these different kind of ways. And so the dictionary will list them. And then the meanings are grouped. That's kind of nice, right? So a lot of times you'll have like it's almost like an outline. Here's the basic meaning, and then there's some subcategories. We already saw some of those in some of the words. So that helps you to kind of like get your mind around a word and all the different meanings it can have. Some meanings are like dialectical differences. We're going to see this now this isn't true for Hebrew so much, but like even Greek, certain words, yeah, they can you ever listen to British shows or whatever, and it's like they're using English, they're speaking English, but they don't talk like we do, right? They're using words, like words even can have different definitions in their version of English versus ours, right? And so that can happen, that's not super common in the Bible, but and then some of the meanings can be just like very rare, obscure, or even just like old meanings that we would never use today. I mean, like the classic examples like gay, it's like it used to mean happy. Now it doesn't mean that anymore. It's come, so I mean, that's just the one that came to my mind. But obviously there's tons of words that's just like, it's still a word that's used today, but it doesn't mean what it used to mean. So that can happen too. All right. And then once again, we talked about some of the meanings can be like really narrow and specialized. So let me just I'm going to get through this, and then we're going to just look at the English word run, and we'll just kind of look at some examples. And I think it will help us to kind of just think about a word in our own language to see, oh, this is just how words work, right? We don't think about it, right? You talk all the time. I don't know, in the last year, how many times you use the verb run. I don't know. It's probably a lot, and you never probably thought about the definition of the word, right? But now what we're doing is we're just trying to be cognizant of how we're even using our own language, right? Because that will help us to apply that to how we study another language. You tracking with me? So once again, there's the different definitions, and then context. Once again, so this word, you look at the definition, here's all the things it can mean, and what does context do? Limit it down to this is what it means here. Okay, so we've already said all these things. And then I will say this, there is a difference between the definition of the word and the theological significance of the word. Okay, so this is really important. So for example, the word covenant, what's the word covenant mean? Oh, it's an agreement, it's a promise. You could look at the definition of that. But often, like for example, in the Torah, Moses will use the word covenant, and he's talking about, let's say, the Abrahamic covenant, right? But the word covenant, it doesn't mean the Abrahamic covenant. Even in that context, that's what it could mean. So what the danger of that is what you could do is you could read back the Abrahamic covenant into the word covenant, and then when that word is used somewhere else, you import that freight into that context. Does that make sense? So the word covenant just means a covenant. In a certain context, it could be referring to the Abrahamic covenant, but it doesn't mean that. Does that make sense? So you just got to be aware, like the meaning of the word, sometimes it could carry along some, or salvation, or some of these different words, we could kind of import some freight back in. Or like the word redemption. Okay, so the word redemption means bought for a price. But then we hear that and we think of like, oh, we've been redeemed by Jesus' blood. He gave his life for us. Well, the word redemption inherently doesn't mean it cost a life. You with me? It means it cost a price, right? And so when Paul says you were redeemed, we know, oh, we were bought by Jesus paying for us with his life. So that's what it means there, but the word doesn't mean inherently like somebody gave their life for you. Does that make sense? Like in context, that's what it means because he's talking about Jesus. But I think that's helpful because sometimes what we could do is every time you see the word, so then, for example, if you're reading the Gospels, and I don't even know if this happens, but, it says, oh, he redeemed this, and it's not talking about, being redeemed from our sin. It's just using it in the normal, everyday sense of the word. You want to read all that back into it. Yeah, exactly, right? Good. So you don't want to read all that into the word. So what's the definition of the word? And then that's the beautiful thing about words is that they can kind of carry these different significances and point back, but you don't want to import that in every time it's used. We'll see some examples. As I always said, Ephesians. Like in Ephesians, we have redemption through his blood. There, clearly, we were bought with the price of Jesus' life. But the word redeem doesn't always mean that. Exactly, grocery store coupons, exactly, right? You don't want to be like, man, I bought these groceries with my life, no, it doesn't mean that, right? It's just, no, I just used a coupon, right? Yeah, good example. I'm going to skip the Hebrews example. We've looked at that one before. Um, I'll look at this example. So this is kind of interesting. Like in Ruth, the guy, you remember we were just talking about that, right? The kinsman redeemer, Boaz is the kinsman redeemer, but he wasn't the closest family member to Naomi. There's this other guy, and actually he's called in Hebrew so-and-so, right? Now, so-and-so, that's kind of literally what the word means in Hebrew. So it doesn't, how do I say this? It's very kind of common word. It just is a way of like referring to someone without their name, right? But it doesn't have all this theological significance. But in Ruth, it's very significant, right? Because there's a lot about a name, right? So Boaz risks his life and his reputation. I'm not going to get to the whole book of Ruth, but he lays down his life to care for Ruth. And what does he get from it? He gets a name and a reputation. And this other guy that rejected the opportunity to redeem, in the text, he's just called so-and-so. And so theologically, it's very rich and significant. Like, he doesn't get named, but Boaz does. And it's really significant there. But so-and-so, it's not like that word means all that, right? But in the context of Ruth, it's very, that use of, like, the fact that he isn't named, he's kind of called this funny name a little bit. Like, man, that's very theologically significant. You tracking with me? He's not named. He's the guy that shall not be named, kind of thing, right? So, but the word itself doesn't communicate all that. It's just how it's being used. Yeah. All right, so now we're going to get into the English word run. And I didn't even put all of them in here. I mean, there's just so many definitions to run. But I think it will be, it's kind of a fun exercise. But I just think it will be helpful for us to even realize how many, once again, if I asked you, define the word run, probably all of us would say, oh, on two legs, going as fast as you can. We all know what running is. But man, this word, if you really slow down and think about it, we use it all the time for a bunch of different things. So the first definition, right? Number one, the root basic idea, notice it starts with like vertebrates, right? Like you got a skeleton, right? And you move swiftly, right? So I think you could probably even say like vertebrates with legs. Like, it's like, they didn't put that in the definition, but I would guess that's what, like, I don't think you'd say the snake ran somewhere, right? The snake's got bones, but it doesn't have legs, right? So I think this is implying, like, you got a skeleton, you got some legs. Now, a dog can run, even though it's got 4 legs. It doesn't imply that you're bipedal, but anyway, so we all know that. So, to move forward, so here's the definition, right? And notice it says intransitive, right? Without a direct object. To move forward quickly upon 2 feet by alternately making a short jump off of either foot. I'm trying to remember now. Like, have any of you ever done, what are those like races where like you're not allowed to run? Speed walking races, right? Like you go as fast as you can without what? You can never be like completely off the ground. Like one of your feet, isn't that the rule? Right? One of your feet always has to be touching the ground because the moment you get off the ground, you're running, right? So that's this definition. Like in English, you could be going really fast speed walking, but you're not running by definition if your feet aren't off the ground. That's why it says like a short jump, like you're airborne. You with me? Like running and fly. So that definition is really helpful, isn't it? Like because we don't think about that, but if you saw someone, you're like, oh, if they were speed walking, even if they're going super fast, you wouldn't say they're running, would you? You inherently know they're not running. Because we know this is the definition. No one's ever defined it for you, but you're an English speaker, you intuitively know that's running, that's not. Okay? But imagine if you didn't speak English, wouldn't this be super helpful? Like in some other language, they don't have a word for run, they just have move quickly. Right? But run is like something very specific in English, right? Another intransitive, to go at a fast pace. The horse ran the length of the track. I've been running all over the building. So that one's kind of interesting, right? Running all over the building, it doesn't necessarily mean you're running, does it? You might still just be going quick, but you're like, man, I was running around all day. Wait, do you literally mean running? Maybe not, right? and so you could see like, oh, sometimes run, and now, but we get how that meaning clearly is related to the first one, right? So like there's the technical definition of running, but then this one's kind of like, oh, just moving quickly. Then you could get into transitive, like every day I run my dog. So now it's like you're making your dog move quickly. You with me? So transitive means it has a direct object. I run my dog. I ran the vacuum. Ran your fingers through the hair. Okay, like these are some different kind of usages. To compete in a race, the horse will run the Preakness. I'm not ready to run a marathon. Now, obviously, you run in a marathon, but you could run other kinds of races maybe without running. And this doesn't necessarily imply running. It's like you're in a race. Intransitive, to carry the football, like, so, Pat knows, football player, right? You do a run, right? I mean, you're probably running, but this has a different, like, meaning to it, doesn't it? Well, we're going to just kind of list these, I think, and then we'll kind of try to draw some conclusions from this in terms of, like, how this all works. I'm not going to look at all these. There's a ton of them, right? To achieve or perform by running as if by running. Flee away from danger. Like when he's broke, he runs to me for money. Literally? Maybe not. But now so that's the first major definition. All those are under that. Now the second major definition of, notice it just says fluids. So now it's not characterizing like transitive or intransitive. It's just like when you're talking about fluids obviously don't have legs, but they could still run, right? So it means to flow. So you could talk about, there's a strange story. Now, story technically isn't a fluid, but they put it in here anyway, right? Because it's getting that idea from like a fluid, like running water, right? There's a strange story running around the water. The flu is running through the kindergarten, right? Of a liquid to flow. The river runs. The blood is running down your leg, right? So here running is like talking about liquids flowing and stories moving quickly. Like notice it says intransitive, figuratively, right? So like when a story is, like when a flu is running through a kindergarten, like it's a figurative use. You with me? Like viruses don't run in that sense, right? Your nose is running. Well, what does that mean? Your nose, it's like liquid is coming out of your nose, right? Anyway, the hose is running. We say the hose is running, but literally the what? The water's running through the hose, but that's not how we say it, right? So once again, it's like, wait, how's the hose running? How's my nose running, right? But that's how we use it. And once again, the good lexicographer is like categorizing all the different ways. So like if you're just try to imagine you didn't speak English and you said the hose runs, you'd be like, what does that mean? The hose isn't even moving, right? But it's like you got to kind of understand like, and the hose certainly doesn't have legs, and but it's like, oh, I see, like these are kind of all connected. Anyway, I'm gonna keep moving through here. Liquids are flowing, water's running, leaks are spreading. Like that's a good example, right? Like the red rug ran on his white sheet. Like we talk about that with like something, it ran, like the colors, it bleeds, exactly, right? Which is interesting, right? That's a synonym. Right, in that context, you could say the red rug bled on the white sheet, or you could say it ran on it, right? It would mean the exact same thing with two totally different ways of saying it, right? So in that case, those would be just synonymous, but clearly bleeding and running in a ton of other different contexts are not at all synonymous, right? So you see, like in that one little area, those two words can mean the exact same thing. Right. Does that make sense? So like to fuse or to shape something, like to cast it means to run bullets. Like if you're, with metal and that kind of stuff. To go through without stopping, usually illegally, right? To run a red light, to run a blockade. There's nautical definitions: to sail before the wind, social, to carry out an activity, to control or manage, be in charge of. My uncle ran a corner store. She runs the fundraising. To be a candidate in an election, run for governor. Anyway, there's just a ton of these examples. I'm just going to kind of move quickly now. To print or broadcast in the media. Anyway, to run guns. Here's I like this one. Like, to extend in space or through a range, the border runs for 3,000 miles, right? So that's a totally different, example. The leash runs along a wire. The grain of wood runs. Anyway, all right. So let's kind of. I just put like of machines, cars stop running, computers run. All right. So let's just talk about. I'm just going to go through all these. There's so many, right? So what would be just like wrong ways to use the word run, right? So, I mean, I'll let you make up your own, right? But it's like, if you left the hose running, we could think of like subtle examples or really silly examples. But if I say, hey, I left the hose running, there's a ton of things I don't mean. If I say that, we all just inherently know what I mean, right? The water's running. It doesn't mean the water's running quickly, does it? It doesn't imply that at all. But do you see how easy it would be to assume, if you didn't really understand the definition, that meant it's like really going quickly or flowing? Because run often can mean quickly, right? But this definition of run, right, you could, if you go back and read the definition, it just means fluid is flowing, right? And it's not connected to going fast. Does that make sense? And that's what I want you to, that's one of the main things I want you to get from this, is that do you see how easy it would be to import the different definitions into each other? Does that make sense? And we want to be super careful about that, because it's just so easy to do that. Because, just think about the word run. We inherently think move quickly. That's like the basic meaning of the word. So if I'm like letting the hose run, if you didn't speak English, it'd be a very normal assumption to make. Okay, so that's where the dictionary is going to help you out and say like, okay, and a good dictionary, if in English leaving the hose running meant running quickly, the dictionary would tell you. You with me? It would say for a liquid to flow quickly. But that's not what it said. It just says to flow. Okay? You tracking with me? So we can't import these different meanings into that meaning. And you could understand in the Bible how easy this would be, wouldn't it? Right? It's like, man, like I could give those funny examples about the goat or whatever. Like, I let the goat go and I'm forgiving it. I'm finding all this theological significance. Like, I'm so insightful. Like, wow, Josh, like I would have never got that when you let the goat go, you were letting go of your sin and you were forgiving yourself. And, like you're doing, and it's like, wow, you got so much out of that word. I made it all up, right? It's like, that's not what was meant. You tracking with me? And so if we start thinking about the way we use our own language, we would realize that, right? That we don't, usually if we're just saying, we're not like meaning a whole sermon in one word, right? But it's just really easy to fall into that, okay? I just came up with just like this morning, right before class, came up with a couple examples, right? If I say our supplies are running low, same thing, right? It doesn't mean quickly, right? I don't want to import that in. It just means we're low on supplies, right? Doesn't mean we're running low on supplies quickly or something's happening fast here, okay? Right, here's another example. If I say don't run that computer program, I'm not picturing the computer like a person and saying that, like coming up with this great analogy of how this computer is like a person who runs, or you know what I'm saying? Like I'm just, the computer programs run. That's just what they do. It doesn't mean literally, it's just that's how we use our language. And you see where I'm going with all this? Okay, so once again, if you understand how words work, they have this range of meaning, like all these different definitions. One of those definitions is meant in the context. Okay, it's helpful to understand how the meanings are related, because sometimes, right, like in the idea of forgiveness, you could see how forgiveness is letting go of a debt. Okay, that's helpful, right? But I don't, and you could see from the dictionary that that idea of letting go of a debt is in that sense of the word. But I don't want to read a bunch of other meanings into all, every word I use. Anyone else think of any funny examples just from Run here? Like, did you notice how, most words do not have this many definitions. I picked one of the most extreme examples, right? But I think it's helpful, to be like, oh, wow, when we talk, most of the time, we don't even think about all the other, it's just the way, God made our brain so amazingly, didn't he? Right? Like most of the time when you're talking, you're not even thinking of the different ways that word could be used, right? And it's the same with the biblical authors. They're not like, every time they're saying a sentence, they're not thinking of every different definition of the word. As I'm teaching right now, we all talk. How many words a day, right? You just talk. You're not thinking that carefully about every single word. Now, hopefully you're thoughtful with your words, right? You're trying to communicate, but I don't know, if you just to count the number of words just in this lecture, this class, I'm not giving much time to each word in that sense. It's just amazing how our brains can we're trying to say something, here's the word that captures that, right? And that's just, now sometimes an author will really, even when I'm writing a sermon, if I'm coming up with the sermon title or something, sometimes I will spend a lot of time trying to pick just the right word that's going to capture what I'm trying to say. Or sometimes you're writing something, you might spend some time, but normally, right, the meaning is found kind of in the sentence, and your brain inherently knows how to pick the right word that's going to fit in there. The trouble is, of course, if we all spoke native Greek and Hebrew, we wouldn't be having this discussion, because we would just know what the words meant intuitively, just like you understand what I'm saying. But our problem is we don't speak Greek or Hebrew, or we're reading, our English Bibles, and the Bible wasn't written in English, so that's why we're like, well, what does this word mean, right? And it would be easy to just assume it means what the English word means, but it never perfectly means that. That doesn't mean that the English translation is bad. It doesn't mean that at all. Most English translations are great, and to translate aphiemi as forgive, that's a great translation, but it can't capture the whole sense of that word. You with me? Okay, so once again, you look up a word in a dictionary, note the different meanings. Okay, which one is used here? In one sense, it's that simple. But yeah.
Yeah, I think super helped by this, but I think at the same time, this can stir up just some angst, right? When we approach the word, and just what does any of this mean? Then, right? None of the words may mean what I think they mean, right? And so I guess what would be your response would be to just to maybe even calm the anxiety, just okay, yeah, but you can still in one sense, right, still trust, right, obviously the translation, right, that they're doing the work to capture that to some degree, right, and so as to not maybe stir up angst. Right?
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, thanks, Key. Yeah, so we want to keep repeating that. I'm glad you bring that up. Our English translations are good. You could read your English Bibles and understand what it means, and that's the beauty of language, right? That it could capture and once again, the meaning is found in the flow of thought, and good translators are capturing that. And so, we could be so thankful for our English Bibles, right? And so what we're trying to do here is just slow down a little bit. If we're studying, okay, just ask ourselves, why is the author using this word? What does he mean by it? How's this? It helps us to go a little bit deeper in that sense, a little bit richer, to understand the full meaning of what he's trying to communicate. So I think that's a great, a great help for us, just like there's once again, we're looking at a lot of different tools to help us get at what the author meant. We're going to look at, throughout this class, we're going to look at a lot of tools. We're going to look at the structure of a passage. We're going to look at, a lot of different tools, right? The grammar and the structure. And all these tools are just trying to help us to get at what does the author mean, what's he emphasizing, and what's he trying to communicate. And there's just a ton of different, tools that we could use to really get at that. So, yeah, I think you're right on, Key. We don't want this to, say, oh, we don't have good English Bibles. It's just help us to get a little bit richer in terms of what is being communicated. That's good. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think something I may I'll add to that too is like, it sounds like, right, like you're saying, the English translations or in another language too can be fairly accurate and they're trustworthy, right? But it's like, and, once we're equipped to do, I guess, a deeper study, then we can add the nuances and maybe a richer understanding for our own walks, right?
Yeah.
But I think the caution that I think you're giving is really when you're doing it yourself and applying these tools to study it, because I think once you start learning and looking into the definitions of words in a different language, right, then now you're responsible for how you sort of like understand and apply that sort of like reasoning that maybe the translators had already done.
Mm-hmm.
And so because we're new to this, right, there's a lot of like areas that pitfalls that we could fall into, right? So I guess less worry and anxiety when reading a translation, but maybe more caution when you're doing your own word study from scratch.
Yeah. And I think, once again, just the richness of Scripture, there's so, we want to just mine the depths, right, of just like, what is God communicating? It's so rich to us. There's so many different ways to kind of get at that. And that's the beauty of Scripture, right? It could be understood by a child, but studied for the rest of your life, and you'll never exhaust the depths of it. And there's always that tension, right? Like, we want to keep going deeper and understand more clearly what God's communicating, and about himself and about his plan and who we are. And as you said, just take that and apply it personally to our lives. But any verse, you could read it and understand it too. And there's just a beauty of simplicity there. So I think you're right. We want to hold those in tension. We want to constantly grow in going deeper, but never, arrogant about that, or never thinking like we've arrived and we don't need to grow anymore. But just really trying to get at, what is the author emphasizing? That's what we're going for. Yeah.
So it also sounds like it's speaking to the culture of the language as well. So like Americans will say, I'm going to run to the store, meaning we're going to go get groceries. In Canada, they say, I'm out and about, when they mean they're running errands. And so it really does it's more of almost like this, what we're doing here fits in with your previous classes, with the historical, the cultural, the geographical context. It's just another lens to kind of filter out, what is specific to the passage we're in.
Yeah, and I think really what I'm talking about too is how easy it is for us to import our baggage in how we take the word. And so in one sense, what I'm trying to do is almost go simpler in some ways, right? Because we could just import so much of the baggage that we have in our English words, and we're saying, well, let's just keep with the simple. Because, in one sense, you look at a word and it says, like, all these definitions could be overwhelming, but each one of the definitions is pretty simple. You know what I'm saying? Pretty short. And it's like, once you find the right one, it's just like, oh, this is simple. This is what this word means. And it kind of limits us out from some of the rabbit trails we could go on. That's why I'm saying, like, where we could just go in our own heads with like what it could mean in our language and get off on all these kind of weird ideas. Okay. Now the other way that we can study a word, and this is the one that you were bringing up, Pat, is use a concordance or Bible software. Just look up all the different times in your book of the Bible, or, if you're really doing an in-depth Bible study, you could do this, right? And see, it's used 10 times. You're studying whatever holiness, and you're studying Isaiah. See how many times he used it in Isaiah. How does he use it? Or if you're using a pretty common word, you probably don't want to study all 100 times or 200 times it's in the whole Bible, but maybe you just limit it to your book. How does he use this word throughout this? And that's a great way to do it. And, find all the ways it's used in this book, or maybe it's even just like, Paul. How does Paul use this word? I'll just study in all the different times Paul used it. Or maybe you do check the whole New Testament. And what you would do is just kind of the same thing that we saw with the dictionary. Like, just how's all the different ways? Just group them. How's he using it, right? And you could almost do what the people who write the dictionary did yourself. And sometimes it's just helpful to like see, he used this word 10 times. Here's what he meant. It's usually the same way. And just sometimes just seeing it in a few other contexts just kind of helps you understand what he's doing in your text. And it doesn't have to take a long time. It doesn't have to be this, days and days of study. It's just like if you have a computer program, we could talk about that too. Just search this word. Oh, it's 5 times. Just read those 5 verses. It just kind of gives you a little bit better understanding of how that word is used. And sometimes it could be simple, but if you're doing a real in-depth study, that's what you do. Once again, you group similar contexts, similar usages, note the context of each. And it just kind of gives you I see how this author's using it. Yeah.
So I'm trying to think of how to word this question. If you're having a conversation with somebody, maybe apologetically, and you come to maybe a word that obviously has multiple definitions, how do you think it's best to convey that to where they understand it's not like you're trying to pull the wool over their head?
Right.
No, this word doesn't actually always have to mean this. It can mean this without them being like, no, you're just picking and choosing where you want this to believe this.
Right.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, for sure. And that's where you probably would want to appeal to a dictionary, right? Like, hey, look for yourself. This is the definition, right? And you could even just walk them through it. I'm not making this up, like I said, obviously the English word run, it's got all these, but most words probably has 2, maybe 3 definitions. I chose the most extreme example, but most words you'd look up as 2 or 3, and you could say okay, it's got to mean this, this, or this. That's your options, right? In the context, it clearly means this, and you could see that for yourself, Now, if someone's not teachable, obviously you're never going to be able to convince them. But the nice thing about this and kind of this whole class in that sense is you don't trust me for it, right? Let's study it for yourself. You could look up these words in your own dictionary. You could look at, see what it means. You could, the tools that we're talking about here, anybody could do them. And that in a sense, we're getting away from kind of a mystic interpretation where it's well, this means this to you, or whatever you want it to mean is what it means. We're saying, no, just what's the word mean? How's it, in that sense, it's pretty simple, and I know we're getting into all the complexities of it, and we're talking about all the nuances and all that. But really, maybe I should just had some time to do it. Just that's why I listed those. Just look up the word. Oh, in this context, it means divorce. Right. Oh, okay. I see that. I can see it for myself, and so I think, and once again, most of the time, here we're more talking about you're studying a passage, most of the time, kind of as Keelan brought out, you read a passage, you know what those words mean in English. It was translated for you. You don't have to look up every word to understand what the sentence, for God so loved the world, he gave his one and only son. Whoever believes in him will not perish but have eternal life. You know what that means, right? You don't need to look at, now if you look up every one of those words, you look up believe, so that would be a great example, right? You could see belief is not just intellectual assent. The word belief has to do with trusting, and we could talk about what belief, genuine faith really is. And you could get that from that word where in English, believe, we could think of it as long as I believe Jesus rose from the dead, I'm saved, right? And it's no, that doesn't really get at what that word in Greek means, so that will give you a little bit more, depth to that passage, but I think you could get that just from reading your Bible, right? That that you aren't saved just by believing some facts, right? James says even the demons believe and shudder, right? So they know some facts. They're not saved. So you don't have to look in the dictionary to know that. You could go to James and see that. But the dictionary would help you out a little bit and say this word doesn't just mean knowing facts, right? It has to do with trust. So that's a great example, right? If you're really studying John 3:16, the dictionary is going to help you with that word. Perish, will not perish. You probably just know that means die, right? You don't probably need it. But if somebody's well, perish just means, and they spouting off some weird idea, it's well, let's look up that word. It means to die. It's not that hard. And you knew that anyway. I didn't have to tell you that. But the dictionary would be no, that's what it means, right? So is that helpful? For the most part, to your point, Key, read John 3:16. You know what it means, but it can help clarify some things if there's some confusion to have a better understanding of the words. Yeah, that's great. All right, so now we're going to look at kind of the fallacies. And I mentioned a lot of these kind of along the way, but it's kind of helpful just to, there's a whole book. D.A. Carson, I don't know if you ever heard of him. He's a famous, you'd say, exegete and theologian. He has this short little book, Exegetical Fallacies, that a lot of these come from there. And just, once again, this is all the ways that this could just go wrong. And then they're kind of comical, but hopefully this will, make sense. So like, a word has a basic or root meaning, and that's present in all the other meanings, right? So those are the examples I gave already about running, right? Like if I say the hose is running, it doesn't mean the hose has legs. It doesn't mean that the water's running quickly. You with me? Like that's this root basic meaning is like that idea must be present in all the other meanings. No, it doesn't have to. You with me? I gave this. Like your nose is running doesn't mean your nose has legs. Your mucus is coming really fast out of your nose. So the next one, the first three are very similar. The root fallacy, meaning the oldest meaning of the word is present in all. So some of them is like, well, just if the first definition in the word, that's present in all of them. This is saying like the oldest meaning is present in all the meanings. So this would be like for example, in 1 Corinthians 4:1, the word servant is used. But literally, the oldest meaning of the word is like an under rower. Like you ever see like those slave ships that they used to have, right? Someone rowing. Well, that was like the old meaning. That's what that word used to mean in Greek. But it just meant servant, right? So it didn't have this idea of like slavery and rowing a ship. And if you tried to read that into that past, everywhere that word was used, you get off on this idea. Does that make sense? Like here's an example from French. Like the word chivalry has to do with like like chivalry comes from the French word for like a horseman. So like if you're like, oh, that was very chivalrous of you. I don't mean you're being like a horseman, like you know how to ride a horse, like obviously, right? So we could use these kind of comical examples in English. But once again, we laugh in English because we're like, that's ludicrous. We'd never do that. But when we jump to another language, we do it. Right? So once again, just being aware, we do this, people do this all the time. You wouldn't believe, just the number of sermons I've heard where people do all these things all the time, right? It's just very common. Anachronistic fallacy, that's like, anachronism means like out of time. So that's like a meaning of the word that has later, you put it into the now. So it's kind of similar, but like, So, for example, modern Greek and modern Hebrew, those are like thousands of years removed from biblical Greek and biblical Hebrew. So the meaning now doesn't necessarily mean it had the same meaning then. Same thing, like there's a lot of words that have, like it's the same word in English and in Greek because they had a common ancestor language. And so, I'll give you one example. The word dynamite. I don't know if you knew this, but like the Greek word for power is dunamis. And you could hear it, dunamis, dunamite. It's like the same root word. Well, and the word means power. So guess what preachers do all the time? The gospel is the dynamite of God. Like it's explosive power. Okay, like that's maybe a great illustration. It preaches well, but it doesn't mean that, right? It doesn't mean dynamite. It just means power. Right? That's the word. And we got our word for dynamite from their word for power, but it doesn't mean like that's reading dynamite back in. You with me? Like you look at the dictionary, it's not going to say anything about dynamite, I promise you. Right?
In English, don't we call this idioms?
Like what?
Like the driving at the wall.
Oh, those are idioms, yeah. But this is maybe similar, but it's different because we're talking about like just a single word and its meaning. Yeah, and like how like a later meaning of a word could like you could read it into the meaning in the Bible. So like whenever you see the word power in the Bible, don't think it means explosive power or like something like that. It doesn't. Dynamite, wasn't invented for 1,000. It wasn't invented yet, right? So just because they use the same word, but there's just a lot of examples where you could do that. I'm not ashamed of the gospel. It's the explosive power of God. Nothing's blowing up in Romans, okay? But it does mean power, And you could, it is powerful, right? But not explosively so. The all meanings fallacy, that's like where you're trying to take every one of the meanings and shove it back into your word. So unless the author's making some sort of a pun, he means one of the meanings. Like it's very, very rare that he's doing that kind of pun. So yeah, I like I said, I've just seen this. Like people think they'll look up a word in a Bible study, right? And they see all these meanings and they're like, wow, this word is so rich. They're well-intentioned, right? And they're like, look at all the things it can mean. And they're like, man, it just feels really insightful to like put them all into that one verse. Like, look at the richness of what it's saying. And like if I talked about the water was flowing, I'm like, man, it's so fast. And I could just go on and on about all those different meanings of run, right? And yeah, like a race, it's running. And you're just like importing all that stuff into that word and you're shoving it in there. And it's like, whoa, that word can't hold all that. All right? Like it means one of those meanings. And unless the author is somehow like doing a word play, that can happen, but it would be clear in the context, right? That he's like making kind of like, he's talking about computer, but he's comparing it to running a race or whatever. And you're like, okay, I could see he's making a pun, but most of the time, just one of those meanings is right. The rest of them, ignore them. Okay, you with me? Well, that's what I said. Like, even though aphiemi can mean divorce, it doesn't always. So, like, I'm talking about divorcing the goat again and stuff, I just let the goat go. I don't bring all those meanings in and, like, all the theological are just so significant. I should have found an example right from the Bible where he uses aphiemi and, like, try to translate divorce. We'd all laugh, But, I did. Here it is. Matthew, like, he left the crowds. Oh, man, preach a sermon on that right there. He divorced them. Jesus was saying now, crowds, I'm done with you. I don't want you anymore. Right? You could preach it, right? It would be great. Or like, you go with the other, pick a different one. He forgave the crowds. Man, Jesus here, no, he's just saying he left, okay? He's not pulling all that stuff. You see what but do you get how easy that would be to do? And man, it would preach so well, right? Like, man, Jesus now, I could do a whole sermon on it. Just let me go, and you'd be like, wow, that's so, I didn't know, Pastor Josh, that word had so much meaning. Like, it didn't, like, you with me? But anyway, that's why we want to be aware, because, we don't use our own language that way. Let's not do that to Greek. Right? Equal translation fallacy. So that's this idea that, like, the English word that translates the Greek word has the same range of meanings as the Greek word. And so everything that the English word implies, the Greek word implies. Does that make sense? I don't know. It's hard to come up with great examples for all these. I tried to come up with as many as I could, but the range will always be different. So I did have a couple examples. So one English word may translate two different words, which don't mean the same thing, and vice versa. Or, it's so interesting. Did you know different languages don't even have words for certain concepts that we have? Like I have friends in Cameroon, they're like sin. They don't have a word for sin. How do you translate the Bible? They don't have a word for it. They have no concept, even just like their whole concept of morality and lying. And just everything is different. You got to like explain all this stuff. You can't even pick a word that means sin, right? How hard to translate the Bible. Honestly, and this is the beauty of God, right? That's why you have the Old Testament. I would say in so many ways, the Old Testament defines all the language and concepts that you must understand to get the gospel, right? Like the whole sacrificial system. What's that trying to communicate? Substitution, the fact that sin requires a price. You think about, so many different concepts. What is sin? Read the Old Testament, right? It explains it, it defines it. This is really God's brilliance in the Bible, right? Like all these stories, they're developing these concepts so that when we get to the New Testament and Jesus comes, people can understand. That's why, I don't know if you know this, but missiologically, when people go to other tribes to like translate the Bible and, preach the gospel and plant churches, guess what they do often? They start with Genesis and they start teaching from Genesis. Because missiologists have seen this where people go to a tribe and they preach the gospel. There's Jesus, and he came and died for you and paid for your sins so that you can know God. And they explain the gospel to them. And guess what happens? Most of these tribes are animists, right? They have, let's just add Jesus to our pantheon of gods. They have no concept of sin, right? So let's appease. They have no way to understand the gospel apart from all of this theology, right? So in that sense, the whole Old Testament kind of develops a theology and the terminology for us to understand the words of the Bible. Does that make sense? Okay. So anyway, so for example, certain tribes don't even have numbers. Wow, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. They don't have words for those, right? In Russian, if you think about, and I'm not going to get into it. I don't know how many, we have how many fundamental colors do we have? But in terms of linguistically, I think there's 10 colors, and conceptually, certain colors that we have, our brains connect them to blue, green, red, yellow, orange, whatever. And in Russian, they have one more color, right? That is kind of I can't remember. I think it's like a blue-green. And in our mind, our bucket, anyway, I don't even remember how it goes, but they just have different colors. And so there's just such an interesting interplay between the words that you have and how you conceptualize things, right? So there's kind of this chicken and egg problem with what comes first, the concept or the word, and the words that you have actually affects the way you conceptualize things. That's a whole nother discussion, but even just the way you see color is different because of the words that we have. I don't know if you ever thought about that, but it's true. We could think, oh, that's navy, but we still think of it as navy blue. It's still blue to us, right? But in other, those concepts are different for other people. They just even see colors differently in that sense. Kind of crazy. Obviously they see the same colors, but how their brain categorizes and organizes them is different. Yeah. All right, so I'll give you one example. So in Greek, there's this word diatheke, and it means covenant and will. So when we think of a covenant, what do we think of? An agreement, something like that. When we think of a will, our last will and testament, we have a different word for covenant and will. In Greek, it's the same word. And so if you're going through Hebrews, and he's talking, it's kind of confusing because sometimes it gets translated will and sometimes covenant, but it's the same concept, same word in Greek, okay? And so you just have to understand that if you're going to understand that passage in Hebrews where he's really breaking down will and covenant, because they have one concept and we have two different concepts. Does that make sense? Now, you can understand how a will and a covenant are related, but if you're translating that, you got to translate with two different two different English words. Oh, you want to click that back on? Does that make sense? Because because he's talking about, the author of Hebrews is talking about how with a will, it's necessary for there to be a death. And then he's relating it to the covenant and the covenant with God. And he's like, a death was necessary. And you're like, wait a minute, why does the covenant require that the death is necessary? Because in their concept, will and covenant are the same concept. Anyway, and the author of Hebrews unpacks that. And you got to understand that if you're going to understand that passage. And even when it's translated, you want to know, hey, this is the same word. Sometimes it's translated will, sometimes it's translated covenant, because we have two different concepts for their one. Does that make sense? And then vice versa. So Hebrews 9, where there is a will involved, the death of the one who made it must be established. And you go read through chapter 9, will and covenant go together. Okay? But then it goes the other way around. So in Greek, they have separate words for flesh and for body, but in Hebrew, it's one word. Okay, so once again, it could go either way. So like in one language, there could be one, in another language it's two, or in one language it's two, in the other one it's one. And so anyway, I'm not going to get into too many examples of that, but beware of thinking like just because in English, just because this word is diatheke, it must always be translated covenant, or must be always be translated will. No, to go back to the circles, the Greek word diatheke is a bigger circle than our word for will or our will for covenant, and you can't just think of it as one of those because their word is bigger than ours. Does that make sense? Okay, so don't think like you just got to always use one word to translate this word. It won't work. All right. Now, with that, like, there's always a way to communicate. Like, so for example, you talk about some tribes don't have numbers. Could you translate the Bible into those languages? You can. And there's always a way to communicate, but it would just take more words and more explanation. And there's always a way to kind of like explain something, even if there's not just a single word for it. So sometimes if you don't have the concept of sin, in your Bible, that's going to be tough to translate the Bible, but you can explain the concept of sin. You with me? And so there's always a way to communicate, but sometimes you don't just have like a single word for it. All right, the synonyms. All right, just because words are synonyms doesn't mean they always mean the exact same thing. So synonyms can overlap but not be identical. They could have the same referent but not mean the same thing. I'm going to get to that in just a second. And they could be synonymous in one context but not in another. So like going back to your example, Diana, of like, bleeding and running, like garments, like they can be synonymous here, but then in another verse, they don't mean the same thing. So let me give you one example. Like if I say believers or saints or God-fearers, okay, we would say those all refer to the same people, right? The people of God, right? We're believers, we're saints, we're those who fear God. So it's the same referent. We're talking about believers, we're talking about the people of God, but those words mean different things. And they're emphasizing different things about God's people, right? So saints emphasize that God's people are holy. Believers emphasize God's people have faith. God-fearers emphasize God's people fear him, right? But they're all referring to the same people, but that doesn't mean they mean the same things. Okay, does that make sense? Contextual import, that's because the word means something in one context. We like try to jam that into the other context. Everywhere it's used. Do I have an example? So, for example, the word law. Sometimes when Paul uses the word law, he's referring to the Mosaic law, but not every time. Does that make sense? So the word law just means law, right? It doesn't always sound. Now, a lot of times in Romans, it means the Mosaic law. That's what he's referring to, but that's not what the word law means. So in Romans 7:21, he says, "For I find it to be a law or a principle that when I want to do right, evil lies close at hand." I find it to be the Mosaic law. That's not what he's saying, right? He's like, there's this principle, this law, at work. And so you can't import, even though all throughout Romans 7, he talks about the law, he's talking about the Mosaic law, all throughout that chapter, even in the near context, he's using law to refer to the Mosaic law. He's not using it that way here. And you can't import that into here. Does that make sense? Even though elsewhere he says law and it means the Mosaic law, clearly. Yeah.
I'll talk about another example, because I've run into having to explain this, is the word, when the Bible uses the word flesh. And so like there's, times where they talk about like your actual flesh, and the other like the sinful flesh. And so if someone didn't understand that, I can see them thinking like, oh, and the word became flesh. And so it's like, that can obviously mess you up a lot.
Yeah, that's a great example, Pat. Yeah, the word became flesh. That doesn't mean the word became sinful, like obviously it's heresy, and we get that, we know that, but that's, once again, just being cognizant of these things, because maybe that example's obvious, but other examples we do that and it's not as obvious. Great example. Background fallacy, here's an interesting one, like there's a historical background to this word that makes it mean something other than what it normally means. The clearest, there's a massive debate about this, the word gospel, right? So the word gospel, you probably know, means good news, but people have studied and they find the word gospel in normal Roman literature and with Caesar. So like Caesar would, there would be the gospel, this announcement, this proclamation, this good news that Caesar has come and he's going to fix this city or bring peace or whatever, right? And so there's a lot of people, a lot of scholars even, that would say that the word gospel means that Jesus is Lord, creator of heaven and earth. He's the king who's come to make things right and doesn't have anything to do with sin. Okay, there's a lot of people that would say that his death to pay for sin. Like the gospel is the good news that Jesus is Lord. That's what they would say. And I would say that that's this fallacy, right? That they've kind of taken some of the background to this word and they've made it mean that instead of kind of seeing how the author's using the word. So anyway, that's a bigger debate, but people... Right. The technical meaning fallacy, like so we talked about, words can have technical meanings, but but that means, oh, it always means that, or in this case it's a technical term, so it doesn't mean. Once again, you just always got to be careful when someone starts saying, "Well, I know what this word normally means, but all right, I want some proof. Give me some. Show me in the dictionary. Show me, like you got to prove this to me." And once again, I kind of mentioned propitiation, right? Some people would say that about it. Like it doesn't mean God needs to be appeased anyway. It doesn't imply God's wrath. So, Jesus is the propitiation for our sins. Just means he pays for our sins. It doesn't imply anything about God's wrath needing to be satisfied. So we kind of talked about that. And then the one meaning fallacy is that this word always means the same thing everywhere, right? And once again, that's not how words work. I mean, you could find in the same chapter. Now, usually, if an author's using a word, let's say he uses it 5 times in the chapter, usually he's going to use the same meaning of the word throughout that chapter. But he doesn't have to. Just like you could say, I went for a run, I ran my business. You could put those in the same paragraph. So can Paul. Okay, so, now, usually in a given context, of course he's going to use the same word the same way. But you can't force him to do that, right? And you got to look at the context and make sure he's using it, look at the definitions, if he could use it in different ways. So Matthew and Paul, they use the word called differently. We used that example in the past. Matthew says, many are called, few are chosen. But Paul says those who are called are saved, are glorified, right? So they use a different meaning. And then lastly, kind of the Bible code meaning. Like, I got to throw this one in. There's kind of like this mystical meaning to words. And, obviously people go crazy with words and come up with all kinds of crazy meanings. And we're just like, nope, not going to go there. There's like, and sometimes you'll see like there's this secret code that unlocks this meaning. Listen, if it's not in the dictionary, like words mean what people use them to mean, right? So there's not like this secret code. If the meaning's not in the dictionary, it doesn't mean that, okay? And then lastly, this kind of goes back a little bit to what you were saying, Keelan. Semantics or meaning, those are synonyms, is more than the meaning of words. So, we took a whole class just to talk about the meaning of words, but I do want to end with this caveat, right? You don't figure out the meaning of a sentence just by stringing dictionary definitions together, right? And I hopefully you know that, but you could go way too far with looking up every word in the dictionary and trying to put way too much weight to the meaning of every word. Once again, I hope I've given enough examples of where this, understanding the meaning is helpful. And it's mostly helpful not to go crazy, with some meaning or import some other meaning in, or, just like, hey, what's just the basic meaning of this word? We're not talking about anything too crazy here, but we do want to make sure to end by saying, listen, the meaning is not just, look up a bunch of definitions and string them together, right? So words, their meanings are important, but not ultimate. There's languages, you got the grammar, you got the whole context, you got the whole flow of thought, and that's really what we're going to be talking about for the whole rest of the class, right? Of just like, how do you understand the structure of a text, the emphasis of the text, the flow of thought of the text. We already talked about the context, right? So these are all just tools Once again, tools in your tool bag when you're studying the Word of God to understand what the author's telling us. All right, any final questions or comments?
I just want to make sure I heard you correctly with the propitiation, because I think I may have used that term before, God's wrath being satisfied, but you're saying don't say that. It's when sin is dealt with.
No, well, I would say the meaning of the Greek word propitiation means wrath being satisfied, but it's connected to the Old Testament, which makes it different from just how the Greeks use that term with their gods. And so, which implies I would just put it this way, this word atonement or propitiation, God's wrath is satisfied when sin is dealt with. And then you just have to have both elements of that, right? And if you just look at people try to make it just one or the other. And so I would say, no, it's both. And, that would be a great word study, to just kind of look at these words in the Old Testament and the New and kind of trace those concepts. I mean, it's a rich, study. You could spend a lot of time in Exodus and Leviticus, right? Just talking about atonement and Yom Kippur and all of that, which really this word propitiation kind of draws into, but also draws into just like in Greek, just like, no, God needs to be appeased. He's angry, right? But not like the pagan gods. Our God is angry because of sin, and he's propitiated when sin is expiated. It's dealt with. It's covered. It's paid for. Yeah. It's good. Yeah.
So are you saying with, the term propitiation, are you saying the way that it's connected to atonement in the Old Testament is that when they translated the Old Testament,
Yes.
they used, it was atonement in Greek, or in Hebrew, and
Yeah.
in Greek they used propitiation
Exactly.
when translating that.
Exactly. And so that's what gives this Greek word propitiation kind of a Hebrew feel to it. But I would say you can't go too far with that. And what some people try to do is, it's got a Hebrew feel to it, so it doesn't have anything to do with wrath. But even in the Old Testament, honestly, the word atonement in Hebrew has more to do with sin being covered and paid for. But obviously you see a lot of atonement and wrath language there as well. But it's not as much baked into the word. And so that's where some, you could call liberal scholars or whatever, will try to say, this word doesn't have to do with wrath. It just has to do with sin being paid for. Anyway, that's a huge, huge debate. I mean, we could get more into it.
Hypothetically, if the New Testament was translated in Hebrew, would that word propitiation then be atonement? If that ever happened?
Yeah.
That's basically what you're saying?
Yeah.
Okay, so it's kind of like how we get the name Jesus, and that, that's not what his family was calling him, but that's the Greek translation of the Hebrew name.
Yeah.
And then we get Jesus from that Greek translation, which is a big deal for people too. Hebrew Israelites, they make a big deal about us calling Jesus and not Yeshua.
Right.
And so it's like, well, we do that because that's just the Greek call. They translated it to
Yeah.
Jesus or whatever, and
Right.
then we just got our English name from
Yeah.
Jesus and not from, because it was written in Greek.
Yeah, exactly. Yep. Yeah.
So, language-wise, I'm like, I never liked English, period. I was always terrible. And I see you have some grammar stuff on here.
Yeah.
Are you going to talk a little bit about excuse me, like Greek structuring or maybe Hebrew structuring?
Well, I mean, honestly, so next class we're going to get into grammar, and we're going to just keep it in English. Right? This isn't a Greek class. This isn't a Hebrew class. I mean, obviously, Greek and Hebrew have their own grammar rules, and if you want to go super deep, you got to, you could learn those languages and whatnot. But we're just going to talk about it in English. Like what's a subject, what's a verb, how does that just help us to understand what the author's saying, kind of get into that a little bit. So once again, it's just another tool to get into grammar a little bit. I know it's kind of technical stuff, right? And I don't want to overwhelm us with saying you got to use all these tools all the time. But I hope it just kind of brings an awareness to what's going on in the Bible and how we could kind of use some of these tools. And I hope to sum up by what are the main tools that we just use every day, and how do we use those? So I know there's a lot of information, but I'd like to, hopefully we'll end with hey, what are the main key takeaways that we use just every day when reading our Bibles? Good questions. All right. Yeah, thanks for coming, and we'll see you next time.